The winter of 1878 came down on the Colorado high country like a fist, and it was in the worst of that first great snowfall that Amos Bridger saw the woman who would change the whole shape of his solitary life, dragging a sledge of green timber through drifts that reached her knees, her shawl crusted white, her breath coming in ragged clouds, and not one soul in the town of Larkspur Hollow stopping to help her. He had come down from his cabin above the tree line only because his salt was low and his coffee gone, a 2-day walk he made perhaps 4 times a year, and he had not expected to find anything in that gray little mining town worth remembering. But there she was at the bottom of the rutted Main Street, hauling a rope harness across her shoulders, hauling logs meant for a stove that would otherwise go cold before nightfall, and nobody moved to help her. Not the men smoking under the mercantile awning, not the boys throwing snowballs by the livery, nobody. Amos Bridger was not a man given to hesitation. He stood perhaps 6'3" in his moccasin boots, his shoulders built wide from 20 years of trapping and packing hides through mountains that did not forgive weakness, his beard dark and touched with the first threads of gray, his hair falling past his collar because there was no barber within 40 miles who could reach him, and no reason he had ever found to seek one out. He crossed that street in long strides, snow crunching under his boots, and without a single word he bent down, took hold of the heaviest end of the sledge rope, the end nearest the largest logs, and began to pull. Susanna Bell nearly stumbled at the sudden lightness of her load, and she turned startled to find a mountain of a man beside her, his jaw set, his eyes the color of river stone, saying nothing at all, simply pulling. "Sir," she said, her voice thin from cold and effort, "I did not ask for help." He glanced at her once, a brief, steady look, and then returned his attention to the road ahead, hauling the timber as though it weighed nothing more than kindling. Still he said nothing. She did not know what to make of a man who would not speak, who simply worked beside her as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if strangers helped strangers every day in that hard, thin-soiled town, when in her experience of the last year, they most certainly did not. They reached the small house at the edge of Larkspur Hollow, a 2-room cabin with a sagging porch and a chimney that had not seen a fire in 2 days, and only then did he set down his end of the rope, straighten his back, and look at the stack of logs they had hauled together. "Obliged," Susanna said, because it seemed the only thing left to say, though her tone carried more suspicion than gratitude. Amos Bridger touched 2 fingers to the brim of his weathered hat, turned, and walked back toward the mercantile without a single word passing his lips, leaving Susanna standing in the snow with her mouth slightly open, unsure whether she had just witnessed an act of simple decency or something else entirely, something she was not yet ready to name. She was 26 years old that winter, a widow of 11 months, her husband Daniel Bell having been killed in a rockslide at the Silver Fork mine the previous January, leaving her with a half-built claim, a stubborn Jersey cow, and a debt to the mercantile that grew heavier with each passing month. She had not asked for pity, and she had certainly not received much of it in Larkspur Hollow, where widows without sons old enough to work were considered a burden the town could ill afford, and where the only man who had shown her any particular attention since Daniel's death was Cyrus Pratt, the mercantile owner, whose interest in her welfare seemed to increase in direct proportion to how much she owed him. That night, after she had got the stove roaring and had eaten a thin supper of beans and cornbread, Susanna sat by the window and thought about the mountain man who had appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly, and she wondered, with an unease she could not quite explain, whether she would ever see him again. She did see him again, though it was nearly 3 weeks before it happened, and by then the snow had piled higher still, burying fence posts and turning the road through Larkspur Hollow into a narrow trench between white walls taller than a man's head. Susanna had gone again for timber, this time to the stand of pine at the base of the ridge where deadfall could be had for the cutting if a person was willing to work for it. And she was willing, because the alternative was to freeze, or to accept Cyrus Pratt's increasingly insistent offers of credit against terms he was careful never to specify plainly. She had felled a modest pine with her late husband's axe, an effort that left her arms trembling and her palms blistered even through her gloves, and she was dragging the section trunk toward the sledge when a voice, low and rough from disuse, spoke behind her. "That trunk will split your sledge rails if you drag it whole." She spun around, heart hammering, to find Amos Bridger standing at the tree line, a rifle slung across his back, a hide pack over one shoulder, his breath steaming in the cold air. He looked, if anything, larger than she remembered, his buckskin coat straining across a chest and shoulders built by decades of hard living, his dark hair loose beneath a fur cap, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel, absurdly, as though she had been caught doing something wrong. "I did not know I was being observed," she said, straightening her spine, refusing to let him see how tired she truly was. "Wasn't observing, was passing." He said it simply, without apology, and then he walked forward, hefted the largest section of trunk as though it were a fence post, and set it onto the sledge himself. "Ought to cut it shorter next time. Save your back." "I did not ask for your opinion on my back, mister." She stopped, realizing she did not know his name. "Bridger," he said. "Amos Bridger." "Susanna Bell," she replied, and something about saying her own name to him, out there in the vast white silence of the mountain, felt like an admission of more than she intended. He took the heaviest end again, as he had before, without asking, without waiting for her permission, and together they hauled the timber back down toward town, the only sounds the crunch of snow and the creak of the sledge runners, until Susanna, unable to bear the silence any longer, asked the question that had been sitting in her chest for 3 weeks. "Why did you help me the first time? You did not know me. You do not know me now, if it comes to that." Amos considered this for a long moment, long enough that she thought perhaps he would not answer at all, and when he did speak, his voice was quiet, almost reluctant, as though the words cost him something. "Man who watches a woman haul her own firewood through snow up to her knees and does nothing is no kind of man worth being," he said. "That is all there is to it." "Some men in this town seem content to be that kind of man," Susanna said, and there was a bitterness in it she could not quite hide. "Then this town has a poor supply of men," Amos said, and though his face did not change, something in his tone suggested he was not entirely joking. They walked the rest of the way without further conversation, but when they reached her cabin and he set down the rope, he did not simply touch his hat and leave this time. He looked at the low stack of split wood beside her door, calculated something behind his gray eyes, and said, "That will not see you through to March." "I am aware," Susanna said tightly. "I have time before I need to be back up the mountain," he said. "I will cut more if you will allow it." She wanted to refuse him. Pride told her to refuse him, told her that a widow who accepted charity from strange mountain men would find her reputation shredded to ribbons by the gossips of Larkspur Hollow before the week was through. But practicality, and something else she did not examine too closely, made her nod instead. And for the rest of that short winter afternoon, Amos Bridger split wood behind her cabin with an axe that seemed like a toy in his enormous hands, the muscles of his back and shoulders working beneath his coat, with a steady, powerful rhythm that Susanna found herself watching from the kitchen window far more than she intended to. Word traveled fast in a town as small as Larkspur Hollow, and it was not 2 days before Cyrus Pratt appeared at Susanna's door, his narrow face pinched with an expression that might have passed for concern in a poorer imitation of a man. "Mrs. Bell," he said, standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, "I heard tell there's a mountain man been seen about your property, a trapper, fellow by the name of Bridger. He has been kind enough to help me with firewood, Mr. Pratt, nothing more." "These mountain men," Cyrus said, shaking his head slowly, "they live wild up there, you understand, away from decent society for years at a stretch. A woman alone ought to be careful who she lets onto her land, especially a woman in your particular circumstances." He let the word circumstances hang there, heavy with implication about her debts, her dependence, her vulnerability, and Susanna felt her jaw tighten. "My circumstances are my own concern, Mr. Pratt," she said, "as is my firewood." Of course," he said, backing off the porch with a thin smile. "I only worry for you, Mrs. Bell, as I have from the start. You know my offer stands. The debt could be settled quite easily, quite comfortably, if you were willing to consider a more permanent arrangement between us. I have given you my answer on that matter more than once, Mr. Pratt." "Winters are long," he said, settling his hat back onto his head. "And they get longer still, the further into debt a body falls." He touched his brim in a gesture that mimicked courtesy without possessing any of its substance, and walked back down the path toward town, leaving Susanna standing in her doorway with her arms crossed against the cold, and against the slow, creeping dread that had lived in her chest since Daniel's death. The dread of what a woman without means might be forced to become in a town that offered widows so few honest paths forward. She did not tell Amos about Cyrus Pratt's visit. Not then, though she suspected, from the careful, measured way he began to arrange his errands in town to coincide with the days he came to check on her woodpile, that he had heard something of the mercantile owner's interest through the ordinary channels of small-town talk. Larkspur Hollow could keep few secrets, and the story of the widow Bell's debts and the storekeeper's persistent courtship was hardly a secret at all. It was in early February, with the snow packed hard and blue-shadowed in the mornings, that Amos arrived at Susanna's cabin not with an axe over his shoulder, but with a haunch of venison wrapped in oiled canvas, and something in the careful way he held it, something almost shy for so large and capable a man, told her this was not merely another act of practical charity. "Thought you might have use for meat," he said, setting it on her porch step. "Winter's hard on a larder." "You did not need to hunt for me, Mr. Bridger." "Amos," he said, "and I did not hunt for you. I hunt regardless. There is simply more meat than one man can eat before it spoils." She almost smiled at that, recognizing the lie for the kindness it was meant to disguise, and she invited him in for coffee, which he accepted with the same careful reluctance he seemed to bring to all offers of hospitality, as though he had spent so many years alone on the mountain that the ordinary warmth of a woman's kitchen was a thing he had nearly forgotten how to receive. They sat at her small table, the stove crackling, the window frosted at its edges, and for the first time since she had known him, Amos Bridger spoke at length, telling her of his years trapping beaver along the Green River before the trade had thinned out, of the winter he had spent snowed into a lime cabin with nothing but salt pork and a Bible he could not read well enough to find comfort in, of the family he had lost to fever back in Missouri before he ever came west, a wife and an infant daughter, both gone inside of a single terrible week, more than 15 years past now, though he said it the way a man says something that has never truly stopped being recent to him. "I am sorry," Susanna said softly, and meant it entirely. "It is an old grief," Amos said. "I do not tell it to be pitied. I tell it because you asked why a man lives alone on a mountain with nothing but his traps and his rifle for company, and that is the truest answer I have." "I did not ask," Susanna said gently, "but I am glad you told me." He looked at her then, really looked at her in the lamplight of that small kitchen, and something passed between them that neither had words for yet, a recognition of shared sorrow, of two people who had each lost what they loved most and had each in their own way been trying ever since to build some kind of shelter against a world that had shown them how quickly warmth could be taken away. "Your husband," Amos said carefully. "The mine took him. A rock slide. He and 3 other men. It was quick, they told me, though I have never been certain whether they said that to comfort me or because it was true." Susanna wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "We were married 4 years. We came out from Ohio with nothing but a wagon and a hope that the mountains would be kinder to us than the land back home had been. I do not know that they were. They were not kind to me either," Amos said, "until recently." The words hung between them, simple and unadorned, but Susanna felt the weight of them all the same, felt the way his gray eyes held hers a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she found herself, for the first time in nearly a year, aware of her own heartbeat in a way that had nothing to do with grief or fear or the cold outside her door. Spring did not come easily to that country. It came in fits, a week of thaw followed by another hard freeze, mud giving way to ice giving way to mud again, and through all of it Amos Bridger continued his visits, sometimes with meat, sometimes with wood, sometimes with nothing at all but his company and his quiet, steady presence, mending her fence, patching the roof where the snow had worked loose a shingle, teaching her, at her own insistent request, how to set a snare so that she would not always have to depend on charity or on the mercantile's exorbitant prices for meat. It was during one of these lessons, out at the edge of the tree line with the last of the winter's snow melting into black earth around them, that Susanna asked him the question she had been circling for weeks. "Why do you keep coming back, Amos? You have your own life up that mountain, your own traps to run, your own cabin to keep. I am not so foolish as to think a man does all this out of simple decency, not this many times, not this long." Amos straightened from where he had been showing her how to anchor a snare wire, and for a long moment he said nothing, his jaw working as though he were chewing on words too large to swallow easily. "You want the truth of it," he said finally. "The truth of it is that I have not felt easy in my own cabin since the first day I saw you hauling that timber through the snow. I have told myself a dozen reasons for coming back here. Your fence needed mending. Your woodpile was thin. But the plain truth, Mrs. Bell, is that I think of you when I am up on that mountain, and I have not thought of anyone in that particular way in more years than I care to count." Susanna's breath caught, and she looked away from him, out toward the ridge where the last snow clung in blue shadow beneath the pines, unsure what to do with the sudden warmth spreading through her chest. "I am a widow with debts and a half-built claim, and a town full of people who would say a great deal about a mountain man courting me," she said quietly. "I have never much cared what a town full of people has to say about anything," Amos said. "I have spent most of my life away from towns entirely, and I have not found myself the poorer for it. What I have found myself these last weeks is lonely in a way I had forgotten I could be, because I have gone and let myself hope for something I thought I had put away for good a long time ago." "And what is it you hope for, Amos Bridger?" she asked, turning back to face him, her heart pounding now in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "I hope," he said, stepping closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, close enough that she could see the flecks of lighter gray in his eyes, the faint white scar above one eyebrow that she had never asked about, "that you might someday come to feel something of what I feel, and that you would tell me plainly if you did, because I am not a man skilled in guessing at a woman's heart, and I would not want to mistake kindness for something more, nor mistake something more for mere kindness." Susanna reached up, without quite deciding to do it, and touched the side of his face, feeling the roughness of his beard against her fingertips, and Amos went very still, as though he were afraid that any movement on his part might frighten away something rare and unlikely to return. "I think," Susanna said softly, "that I have felt something of it for longer than I have been willing to admit, even to myself." It was not yet a kiss, not that day, though the air between them seemed charged with the promise of one, and Amos, ever careful, ever restrained despite the great strength coiled in his frame, simply took her hand from his face and pressed his lips to her palm, a gesture so gentle from so powerful a man that Susanna felt something in her chest that had been frozen since Daniel's death begin, slowly and painfully, to thaw. But Larkspur Hollow was not a town inclined to let love bloom without complication, and it was only a matter of days before Cyrus Pratt learned, through the busy tongues of the town's gossips, that the widow Bell had been seen walking hand in hand with the mountain man Bridger along the ridge trail, and his response was neither patient nor kind. He came to her cabin on a gray afternoon with rain threatening, his face flushed with something that was not entirely anger and not entirely wounded pride, but some ugly mixture of both, and he did not bother with the pretense of courtesy this time. "I have heard talk, Mrs. Bell," he said, standing on her porch with his boots leaving muddy prints she would have to scrub later. "Talk that does you no credit. A woman in debt, consorting with a wild trapper, a man who lives like an animal in the hills, no church, no proper occupation, nothing to recommend him to decent society. Amos Bridger has shown me more decency in 3 months than this town showed me in the 11 that followed my husband's death," Susanna said, her voice steady though her hands trembled at her sides. "I will not stand here and hear him insulted. Your debt to my store stands at nearly $40, Mrs. Bell," Cyrus said, his voice dropping into something colder, more calculated. "I have been generous with you on account of the sympathy I felt for your situation, and on account of my own hopes, which I had thought you understood plainly enough. But a man's generosity has limits, especially when he sees it repaid with this kind of ingratitude. Are you threatening to call in my debt, Mr. Pratt? I am reminding you," he said, "that a woman in your position cannot afford to be careless with the good opinion of the people who hold her welfare in their hands. Perhaps your trapper can hunt you enough meat to survive the winter, Mrs. Bell, but he cannot pay what you owe at my store, and he cannot give you a name that any respectable family in this town would wish to share a pew with." Susanna felt something harden inside her, some last vestige of the fear that had kept her polite and accommodating to Cyrus Pratt for nearly a year finally burning away into something closer to fury. "Then I will find another way to pay what I owe," she said, "and I will do it without selling myself to a man I do not love simply to settle a debt at your store. Good day, Mr. Pratt." She closed the door on him before he could reply, and stood with her back against it, breathing hard, her mind racing through the arithmetic of her situation. The $40 she did not have, the claim that was not yet productive enough to sell for a fair price, the winter's remaining weeks that would require food and fuel she could not simply conjure from nothing. When she told Amos of the confrontation, 2 days later, sitting across from him at her kitchen table while rain drummed steady on the roof, his face went hard in a way she had not seen before, the easy gentleness replaced by something fierce and protective. "He has no right to threaten you," Amos said, his big hands closing slowly into fists on the table. "He has the right of a man holding my debt, Amos, whatever we might wish otherwise. That is how it works in a town like this. Money is its own kind of law. Then I will pay the debt. I will not have you spend your savings on my behalf, not for a debt that is mine to settle." "It is not charity, Susanna," Amos said, using her given name for the first time, and something in the sound of it in his low, rough voice made her chest tighten. "I have furs stored from 3 seasons I have not yet sold, enough to cover your $40 3 times over. I have no family to spend it on, no cabin that needs improving beyond what it already has. I would rather spend it seeing you free of that man's grip than see it sit uselessly in a cache up the mountain. And if I refuse, then I suppose I will simply have to find some other way to be useful to you," Amos said, the faintest hint of a smile touching the corner of his mouth, "seeing as you have made plain that you are a woman who does not accept help easily, even when she plainly needs it." Susanna laughed despite herself, a sound she had not made freely in longer than she could remember, and reached across the table to take his hand, feeling the calluses built by decades of trap lines and axe handles, feeling the gentleness with which he closed his enormous fingers around hers. "If you insist on paying it," she said, "then you will let me repay you in some fashion. I will not simply take charity from you either, mountain man or not." "I do not want repayment," Amos said. "I want only to see you safe, and if I am honest with you, Susanna Bell, I want a good deal more than that, though I do not wish to press you toward anything you are not ready for." "What is it you want, then, plainly, since we are being plain with each other today?" Amos was quiet for a long moment, his thumb moving slowly across the back of her hand, and when he spoke, his voice was low and unguarded in a way she had not heard from him before. "I want to build a life with you," he said. "Not up on that mountain where I have hidden myself away from the world for 15 years, and not in a town that would look down its nose at either of us for the rest of our days, but somewhere between the two, somewhere we might make our own. I want to wake up of a morning and know there is someone in the world who is glad to see my face across the table, and I want to be the man who makes certain no one, not Cyrus Pratt nor any other, ever again has the power to threaten you with hunger or cold or fear. I love you, Susanna. I did not expect to say it so plainly nor so soon, but I find I have no wish to hide it from you either." Susanna's eyes filled with tears she had not expected, tears that were not sorrow but something closer to relief, the release of a burden she had not fully realized she was carrying, the burden of believing herself permanently alone in a hard and unforgiving world. "I love you too, Amos Bridger," she said. "I have for weeks now, though I was afraid to say it, afraid that loving again meant risking the kind of loss I have already survived once and did not think I could survive twice." "I cannot promise you a life without loss," Amos said. "No man can promise that, not in this country, not in any country. But I can promise you that for as long as I have breath in me, you will not face it alone." He rose from the table then, coming around to where she sat, and drew her up into his arms, and this time there was no hesitation in either of them. He kissed her slowly, carefully, as though she were something precious he had waited a long time to be allowed to hold, and Susanna felt the last of her defenses, built up over 11 months of grief and fear and careful independence, dissolve entirely into the warmth of his embrace. They were married in May, when the last snow had finally cleared from all but the highest peaks, and the meadows below Larkspur Hollow had gone green and thick with new grass, in a small ceremony held at the Methodist church that served the town, presided over by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through on his usual route. It was not a large wedding. Susanna had few relations of her own in that part of the country, her parents having passed years before and her only brother having gone east to seek his fortune and never written since. And Amos had no family at all beyond the wife and daughter he had buried in Missouri long ago. But the small gathering that did assemble, a handful of neighbors who had come to respect Susanna's quiet determination over the past hard year, and a few of the trappers and mountain men who knew Amos from his rare visits to town, made up in warmth what it lacked in size. Cyrus Pratt was not among them, having been paid off in full the week before by a stack of prime beaver and marten pelts that Amos had hauled down from his mountain cache with an expression of profound satisfaction, and having subsequently found himself the subject of a fair amount of quiet town gossip regarding his own conduct toward the widow Bell, gossip that eventually cost him no small measure of business and standing. A small but satisfying justice that Susanna allowed herself to enjoy without excessive guilt. Susanna wore a dress of pale blue calico that she had sewn herself from fabric purchased, with some private amusement, from a different mercantile in the next town over, and Amos, scrubbed and combed for the occasion though his hair remained defiantly long about his collar, looked so uncomfortable in the borrowed coat he wore over his broad shoulders that Susanna could not help laughing during the ceremony itself, a laugh that the preacher charitably interpreted as joy, which in truth it also was. "Do you, Amos Bridger, take this woman to be your lawful wife, to love and protect her, in sickness and in health, for so long as you both shall live?" "I do," Amos said, and his voice, though quiet, carried a certainty that filled the small church entirely. "Do you, Susanna Bell, take this man to be your lawful husband, to love and honor him, in sickness and in health, for so long as you both shall live?" "I do," Susanna said, and found that she had never meant any words more completely in her life. They did not build their life on the mountain, as Amos had once done alone, nor in the heart of Larkspur Hollow, where too many memories of hardship and gossip clung to Susanna's original claim. Instead, they built a house together at the edge of the valley, close enough to town for trade and for whatever community either of them wished to keep. Close enough to the mountain for Amos to run his trap lines and hunt through the changing seasons, but far enough removed that it felt, to both of them, like a fresh start built on ground that belonged entirely to their shared future rather than to either of their separate pasts. Amos built the house himself over the course of that first summer, with help from a few of the mountain men who had known him for years and who seemed, to Susanna's quiet amusement, almost as surprised as the town itself that Bridger the trapper had finally come down from his solitary cabin to settle among ordinary folk. The house had 2 rooms at first, much like Susanna's original cabin, but Amos had built it with an eye toward growth, leaving space and foundation stones for additions he spoke of only in passing, as though he did not wish to presume too much about what the future might hold, though the hope in his eyes when he spoke of it told Susanna everything she needed to know. Their first winter together as husband and wife was harder in some ways and easier in every way that mattered. The snow came just as deep, the cold just as biting, but this time when Susanna needed timber hauled or wood split, she did not haul it alone through knee-deep drifts while the town looked on with indifference. Amos was there always, his massive frame bent to the work beside her, and more often than not he simply took the task from her hands entirely, not because he doubted her capability, she came to understand, but because he took a deep and simple joy in providing for her, in being the shelter she had lacked for so long. It was in February of the following year, nearly 2 years to the month since Amos had first taken up the heavy end of her timber sledge, that Susanna told him she was carrying his child, and she had never seen so large and capable a man look so thoroughly undone by joy. He wept quietly, sitting at their kitchen table with her hands held in both of his, and told her that he had believed, since the loss of his first wife and daughter so many years before, that he would never again be given the chance to be a father, that he had made his peace with a life of solitary usefulness in the mountains, and had never expected the world to offer him this particular grace a second time. "You will not lose this child," Susanna said fiercely, though she knew even as she said it that no one could truly promise such a thing in that hard country, where fever and accident and the 1,000 small dangers of frontier life took children with a regularity that broke hearts in every town from the Mississippi to the Pacific. "And you will not lose me either. We will be careful, Amos. We will be careful, and we will hope, and we will trust that we have earned some measure of good fortune after all we have both already survived." Their son was born in November of 1879, a healthy, loud-voiced boy they named Daniel, after Susanna's first husband, a choice Amos himself had suggested without a trace of jealousy, understanding in a way that spoke to the depth of his character that honoring Susanna's past losses was no threat to the love they shared, but rather a part of the same wide capacity for love that had drawn him to her in the first place. "He deserves to be remembered kindly," Amos said, holding the infant against his massive chest with a tenderness that seemed almost impossible for hands so scarred and calloused by decades of hard labor. "And there is no reason our son cannot carry a good man's name forward into a good life." Susanna, exhausted and radiant in the bed where their son had been born not 2 hours before, watched her husband cradle their child, and felt a fullness in her heart that she had not believed possible during those long, hard months of widowhood, hauling timber alone through the snow with no one to share the weight. Life did not become easy simply because love had found her. The frontier remained the frontier, unforgiving in its demands, and there were seasons in the years that followed when illness swept through Larkspur Hollow and the surrounding valley, when a bad summer meant a lean winter, when Amos's trap lines yielded less than hoped, and Susanna's small garden struggled against early frosts. But they faced each hardship together, and that, Susanna came to understand, was the whole of the difference between the life she had lived before Amos Bridger took up the heavy end of her sledge rope and the life she lived after. 2 years after Daniel's birth, Susanna gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Ruth, and 2 years after that, another son, William, so that by 1885 their small house at the edge of the valley had grown, just as Amos had once quietly planned, with 2 additional rooms built onto the original structure, filled now with the noise and warmth of a family that neither of them had dared to imagine possible during the hardest months of that first terrible winter. Larkspur Hollow itself had changed as well in those years, growing from a rough mining camp into something closer to a proper town, with a schoolhouse where Susanna herself sometimes taught when the regular schoolteacher fell ill, and a second church, and a new mercantile that had opened to compete with Cyrus Pratt's, a competition that Pratt, having never fully recovered his standing after the town learned the details of his conduct toward the widow Bell, struggled increasingly to survive. He eventually sold his store and moved on to try his fortunes in a different territory altogether, and Susanna, when she heard the news, found she felt not triumph but only a quiet, distant pity, the kind of feeling one has for a man who never learned that decency was worth more than the debts he tried to collect on it. Amos never entirely gave up the mountain, and Susanna never asked him to. Twice each year, he still made the journey up into the high country to run his trap lines, though the trips grew shorter as the years passed, and as their children grew old enough to accompany him on portions of the easier trails, young Daniel in particular showing an early aptitude for tracking and woodcraft that filled his father with an unmistakable, quiet pride. But he always came home, and Susanna always knew, with a certainty she had never possessed with any surety in her life before him, that he would. It was on a winter evening in 1886, with snow falling soft and steady outside their window and their 3 children asleep in the next room, that Susanna sat with Amos before their stove, much as they had sat that first evening he had come to her door with a haunch of venison and a shy, uncertain offer of friendship, and she asked him a question that had occurred to her many times over the years, but that she had never quite found the right moment to voice. "Do you ever regret it," she asked, "coming down off that mountain that first winter? Your whole life changed because you happened to walk through Larkspur Hollow on the one day I was hauling timber through the snow." Amos considered the question with the same careful seriousness he brought to everything, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight, his hair now more thoroughly silvered than it had been that first winter, though his shoulders remained as broad and strong as ever, the strength of a man who had spent his whole life testing himself against the hardest country in the world and had never once been found wanting. "I do not think of it as regret," he said finally. "I think of it as the one piece of good fortune I received without having to fight the mountain for it. I had spent 15 years up there telling myself I did not need anyone, that solitude suited me, that I had lost enough in my life to know better than to risk loving anyone again. And then I saw you, struggling under a weight no person should have had to carry alone, and something in me simply could not walk past it. I did not decide to fall in love with you that day, Susanna. I do not think a man decides such things. I only decided to take up the other end of the rope, and everything that came after followed from that, the way a river follows the shape of the valley it is given." "I am glad you took up that rope," Susanna said, resting her head against his broad chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, a sound she had come to associate with safety itself. "I do not know what would have become of me that winter if you had not." "You would have found your way," Amos said, wrapping one massive arm around her shoulders. "You were finding your way long before I came along. I only made the road a little easier to walk." "You made more than the road easier," Susanna said. "You made the whole of my life easier and warmer and fuller than I ever believed it could be again after Daniel died. I do not say that lightly, Amos. I say it because it is simply true." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, watching the fire, listening to the wind outside their sturdy walls, and Susanna thought, as she often did in quiet moments like this one, of that first day, the cold biting through her worn shawl, her arms trembling under the weight of green timber, and the sudden, unexpected lightness when a stranger's enormous hands had closed around the rope beside hers and simply begun to pull, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, offering only the quiet, steady strength of a man who could not walk past someone in need without doing something about it. That, she had come to understand over the years that followed, was the truest measure of Amos Bridger's character, more telling than his impressive size or his rough mountain manners, or even the depth of feeling he had eventually confessed to her. He was a man who saw what needed doing and did it, without fanfare, without expectation of reward, whether that meant hauling a widow's timber through the snow or standing between her and a debt collector's threats, or building, plank by careful plank, a house large enough to hold all the love that had grown between them and the children that love had produced. Their daughter Ruth, at 4 years old that winter, had already begun to show a fondness for climbing onto her father's lap and demanding the story of how her parents had met, a story Amos told with far more patience and far more words than he had ever offered anyone during those first solitary years on the mountain, though he always finished it the same way, looking across the room to where Susanna sat mending some small garment or another by lamplight. "And that," he would say, "is how your mother taught this old mountain man that there was more worth living for than furs and solitude, and how I learned that the heaviest loads are always lighter when you have someone willing to take up the other end." Susanna would smile at that, every time, no matter how many times she had heard it, because it never stopped being true, and because looking at her husband across the warm, crowded room of the home they had built together, surrounded by the children they had raised, and the life they had chosen deliberately, over and over, in defiance of every hardship the frontier had thrown at them, she understood that she had been given something rare and precious in a world that so often took more than it gave. The years continued to pass, as years do, bringing their share of both joy and sorrow, as no life, however blessed, is entirely free of hardship. There was a summer when scarlet fever swept through the valley and took the life of a neighbor's child, a loss that reminded Susanna and Amos both of how fragile their good fortune truly was, and they held their own children a little closer in the months that followed, grateful beyond words, when illness passed their household by. There was a drought year when the garden failed, and the game grew scarce even for a hunter as skilled as Amos, and they leaned harder than usual on the goodwill of neighbors and on stores carefully saved from better years. But they endured it together, and endured it well, because that was what they had built between them from the very first day, a partnership strong enough to bear whatever weight the world set upon it. Daniel grew into a steady, capable young man, who eventually took over much of his father's trapping business as Amos's joints began to ache more persistently in the cold, though Amos never fully gave up the mountain even into his later years, insisting that a man who had spent his whole life testing himself against wild country owed it to himself to keep testing, even if the tests grew gentler with age. Ruth grew into a bright, determined young woman who followed in her mother's footsteps and became a teacher herself, insisting, much to her father's quiet pride, that she would not marry until she found a man who understood that a woman's strength was not something to be managed or minimized, but something to be respected and matched. William, the youngest, showed an early talent with horses and eventually established a small ranch of his own in the valley, close enough that Sunday dinners at the Bridger house remained a weekly tradition, even after all 3 children had grown and started families of their own. Susanna and Amos celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in the spring of 1904, sitting on the porch of the house that had grown, over the decades, from 2 rooms to 6, surrounded now by grandchildren who begged, as their own children once had, for the story of the timber sledge and the mountain man who had taken up the heaviest end without a word. "Tell it again, Grandpa," one small grandson insisted, tugging at Amos's sleeve, and Amos, his hair now entirely silver, his enormous frame slightly stooped by age but no less solid for it, no less capable of radiating the same quiet strength he had carried since the day Susanna first met him, laughed and pulled the boy onto his knee. "Well," he began, "it was the hardest winter Larkspur Hollow had seen in years, and there was a woman in this town braver and more stubborn than any I had ever known, hauling timber through snow deep enough to swallow a grown man whole, and not one soul in that whole town thought to help her, until I happened to walk down off my mountain." Susanna listened to the familiar story with the same warmth she always felt, watching her husband's weathered face animate with the telling, watching their grandchildren's eyes go wide with wonder at the image of their grandfather as a wild, silent mountain man striding across a snow-covered street to take up a stranger's burden without a single word of explanation. And she thought, as she often did in these quiet, golden moments of her later life, that there was no story she would rather have lived, no burden she would rather have carried than the one that had led her, through hardship and grief, and finally into a love deeper and steadier than she had ever believed possible, into the strong and steady arms of Amos Bridger. They lived on in that valley for the whole of their remaining years, watching Larkspur Hollow grow from a rough mining camp into a proper mountain town with its own bank and its own newspaper, and eventually its own small hospital, watching their children raise children of their own, watching the wild country that had once been Amos's only home gradually give way, at its edges, to the steady advance of settlement and civilization, though the mountain itself remained as it always had, vast and silent and unchanged above the valley where their love had first taken root. And when Susanna Bell Bridger closed her eyes for the last time, many years later, in the same bed where all three of her children had been born, it was Amos's hand she held, his weathered, work-scarred hand that had once hauled timber through knee-deep snow without asking permission, that had built her a home and a life, and a family out of nothing more than a single act of quiet, unhesitating decency on a bitter winter afternoon, and her last coherent thought, before the peace of a long and well-lived life finally claimed her, was one of profound and simple gratitude that she had lived to see a stranger take up the heaviest end of her burden, and never once, in all the decades that followed, set it back down. Amos Bridger did not long survive her, as is so often the way with couples who have shared a lifetime of devotion, passing quietly in his sleep less than a year later, in the same house, in the same room, with his children and grandchildren gathered close, and the whole of Larkspur Hollow turned out for his funeral, remembering him not as the wild, silent trapper he had once been, but as the steady, generous man he had become. The mountain man who had walked into town one hard winter and never truly left, having found something in that small, struggling valley, worth more than all the solitary freedom the high peaks had ever offered him. They were buried together beneath a single stone at the edge of the valley they had chosen, within sight of the mountain that had first brought them together, and within sound of the creek where Amos had taught all three of his children to fish. And the stone, carved simply at Susanna's own request many years before her death, bore both their names and a single line beneath them, one she had chosen herself, in memory of that first bitter afternoon when a stranger had silently taken up the heaviest end of her burden and carried it faithfully for the whole of both their remaining lives. Here lie Amos and Susanna Bridger, who learned that no load is too heavy when carried together, and no winter too long when shared with love. Their descendants remained in that valley for generations afterward, the Bridger name becoming as much a part of Larkspur Hollow's history as the mountain itself, and the story of how it had all begun, a widow hauling timber through the snow, and a silent mountain man who could not walk past her need without answering it, was told and retold at gatherings and firesides for decades to come, a small but enduring testament to the truth that even in the hardest, most unforgiving corners of the frontier, love could take root in the most unlikely soil, growing strong enough, in time, to shelter generations.